This week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faced an unprecedented diplomatic challenge, raising critical questions about his political future. Could this mark the beginning of the end for the great survivor of Israeli politics? It has been a bruising week for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. On Monday, after announcing a plan to escalate the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, Netanyahu was forced into a sudden and embarrassing climb-down following a strongly worded phone call from U.S. President Donald Trump. Unsurprisingly, this episode triggered uproar in Israel, with opposition politicians accusing Netanyahu of failing to guarantee Israel's security in the north and effectively turning the nation into an American vassal state. This all comes at a particularly inopportune time for the Prime Minister, who is already struggling to maintain control over his unwieldy coalition and is slipping in the polls. Let's begin by taking a closer look at the events of the past few days. On Monday morning, Netanyahu announced that his government had ordered the Israeli military to strike targets in the Lebanese capital of Beirut. This move placed further strain on an already fragile ceasefire that Trump had apparently imposed on Israel back in April. This development was not well received by Iran. Iranian negotiators immediately signaled that they considered this an unacceptable violation of the ceasefire and threatened to withdraw from ongoing negotiations with the U.S. Simultaneously, Iranian state media claimed that Iran could both tighten its control over the Strait of Hormuz, where a small number of ships are still navigating, and, if necessary, block the Bab al-Mandab. This latter waterway, another global trade choke point situated between Yemen and the Horn of Africa, has become increasingly vital to global oil markets as an alternative export route for Arab producers affected by disruptions to Hormuz. These threats were apparently enough to alarm Trump, who called Netanyahu on Monday evening to demand that the IDF pull back from Beirut. According to a report by Axios, Trump was furious, reportedly calling Netanyahu crazy, and asking at one point, "What on earth are you doing?" Now, that Axios report should probably be taken with a large pinch of salt. U.S. presidents have a long history of exaggerating their disagreements with Israeli counterparts to project an image of toughness. Furthermore, in the past couple of months, Axios has frequently acted as a conveniently credulous mouthpiece for the Trump administration, playing up the prospects of new peace deals or ceasefires whenever the market looked a bit shaky. It is also worth noting that Israeli sources, including the famously well-connected Israeli journalist Amit Segal, have essentially denied the report, insisting that the tone of the call was professional, if a bit tense. Nonetheless, whatever its exact tone or content, the call was apparently sufficient to make Netanyahu back down. On Monday evening, Trump posted on Truth Social that Israel will not attack Hezbollah and Hezbollah will not attack them, before claiming minutes later that talks with Iran were continuing at a rapid pace. Unsurprisingly, this episode was immensely embarrassing for Netanyahu and drew criticism from across the political spectrum. Naftali Bennett, the right-wing former prime minister and widely regarded as Netanyahu's main rival in Israel's looming election, accused him of losing control over Israeli sovereignty. Yair Lapid, another former prime minister and leader of the opposition, who recently formed an electoral alliance with Bennett, accused Netanyahu of turning Israel into a protectorate state. Gadi Eisenkot, head of the centrist Yashar party, which has enjoyed a surge in the polls since Bennett and Lapid announced their alliance, claimed there had never been a prime minister in Israel who accepted such a humiliating demand. Netanyahu even took flack from within his own coalition. His far-right national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, for instance, publicly urged him to ignore Trump and escalate against Hezbollah, which, it should be said, is what most Israelis apparently want. In a post on X, Ben-Gvir stated, "You said that a strong prime minister tells the President of the United States, yes, when possible, and no, when necessary. This is the time to tell our friend President Trump, No. This is obviously bad news for Netanyahu on its own, but it is especially detrimental for two additional reasons. First, it has put even more strain on Netanyahu's coalition, which has already functionally fallen apart. The immediate issue here is that Netanyahu relies on two ultra-Orthodox parties for his parliamentary majority, and they are demanding that Netanyahu protect an exemption for the ultra-Orthodox from mandatory military service. This exemption has been in place since Israel's founding as a state in 1948, but it has become increasingly controversial as, thanks to their sky-high birth rates, the ultra-Orthodox population has ballooned and the demands on the IDF have grown. Netanyahu tried to fudge the issue. In mid-2024, after the Supreme Court ruled that the status quo was essentially illegal, his government proposed a bill that would have nominally introduced conscription for the ultra-Orthodox, but contained so many caveats and opt-outs that something like 90% of ultra-Orthodox would have been able to avoid service if they wished. This went down terribly with just about everyone, but Netanyahu was able to temporarily shelve the issue after the war with Iran kicked off. However, last month, after Netanyahu apparently suggested deferring the bill beyond the next election, the ultra-Orthodox parties turned on him and voted with the other opposition parties to dissolve the Knesset early, paving the way for elections in September or early October. The second, and perhaps more important, reason that this episode is especially bad for Netanyahu is that it threatens to undermine his self-cultivated image as Israel's Mr. Security. For context, arguably, the main reason for Netanyahu's enduring electoral appeal in Israel is his long-cultivated image as the only politician who can truly guarantee Israel's security, as willing as any to go to war, whether in Gaza, Lebanon, or Iran, but uniquely able to coax the United States into getting involved as well. A year or so ago, this looked like a convincing pitch. Hamas had been thoroughly degraded in Gaza. Hezbollah's leadership had been decapitated, and Israel and the U.S. essentially won the so-called 1-2-day war in June 2025, striking Iran's military and nuclear facilities with little blowback. Today, however, things look very different. Hamas is still in control of Gaza. Hezbollah has proved a far more capable adversary than the IDF expected when they restarted the conflict a few months ago, and the U.S. and Israel look unlikely to achieve their strategic objectives in Iran. Moreover, this week's events suggest that Trump might well impose a deal on Israel that would not only constitute a strategic failure, viz. Iran, but also hinder Israel's ability to pursue strategic objectives in Lebanon and maybe even Gaza. Of course, a lot depends here on what the U.S.-Iran deal actually ends up looking like, and it would be premature to write Netanyahu off, given his remarkable record. Nonetheless, if this does bring him down, Netanyahu will have dug his own grave, insofar as he has spent his political career perpetuating an increasingly expansive understanding of security, which he has now proved unable to fulfill.